started. I was just checking with the organizers who was going to start, and I am starting. So thank you very much for showing some interest in this topic. It was interesting. I've done some stuff for Victor and his wonderful team, wonderful Victor and his wonderful team before, and it's always fun to do stuff for your community. And this was a request which I had to give a bit of thought to, because it's not the usual presentation I give. It's more in a workshop format, in the sense that there will be plenty of time if you'd like to interact, like to ask questions, make comments. There's plenty of time for that. And I've tried to think of a format which will be attractive, when we do things online and can't really see, well, you can see me, but I can't see you. So the contact is slightly different. And it was a good excuse for me as well, because this always happens when you make new presentations. You have to think about things. And it was a good excuse to think about quality assurance testing in the DevOps context. So thanks for the opportunity to stretch my brains as well. That's good fun. Anyway, you can see, I think this, I'm not sure whether this was the last time I was in Kiev at DevOps stage, but it must have been 2018, I think, maybe 19, but I think it was 18. Anyway, great fun to be there. I wish I could be with you today, but I can't. So maybe another time, hopefully. Please note my contact details bottom left on the screen. Feel free to get in touch with me, to join up on LinkedIn, for instance, if you use that platform. I'm fairly active on LinkedIn and Twitter as well. Don't do anything on Facebook. So those are my two platforms. So if you do want to continue the conversation, if you have any questions that I didn't deal with properly, or any additional questions you'd like to ask, please feel free to get in touch after the session, and I'll do my best to continue the conversation. Now let's and forgive me if I seem a bit confused, because I'm moving in between more screens than I usually do, and I often lose my cursor, and it's going to get even more confusing in a few minutes. Anyway, this is the topic of the talk, the title, The Quest for Quality in DevOps. I thought it was quite a catchy title. Quest is not a very usual word. It means search, but because it started with a Q, I thought it was cute. A search for something that's difficult to find, and quality is certainly one of those elusive topics. Really fascinating what quality is. Most people define it, as you can see here, high degree of, well, not necessarily a high degree, but an implied high degree of excellence, or something for someone. And I think that needs to be underscored. Quality is very subjective. It's for a particular person or a particular group you're doing something for. They will determine whether it's good or not. And finally, the third part of the title, DevOps. It's difficult to pin down DevOps. It's quite an elusive, just like quality is an elusive concept. DevOps is pretty difficult to define as well, but I like to define it as a professional movement, people who've organized themselves, who are interested in the topic. It's an emerging set of technical, organizational, cultural insights. You could say it's principles, practices, tools as well, but I like the word insight. That's quite nice. You get a better understanding of things. For fast and frequent delivery of more resilient IT services, resulting in not only better business bottom line results, that's been pretty well established that DevOps can contribute to the bottom line of an organization, but also to a more healthy and a happy workforce. Putting the fun back into IT is certainly something that the DevOps community like to do. So that's good to be aware of. The learning objectives for this session, I've summed them up in 3 categories: knowledge, beliefs, and feelings. Take them one by one. In terms of knowledge, you may have heard of DevOps before. So you may have a certain understanding of DevOps. I'll be adding my understanding, and I hope that that will enrich your understanding of what it is. And in terms of knowledge, I'd like to point out bits in DevOps, parts in DevOps that are closely related to quality and to testing, quality assurance and to testing. In terms of beliefs, I think the major beliefs that you should end up with are that quality has been built in to the DevOps activities and as close as possible to the source. We often talk about shift left in DevOps, getting the quality as close to the source as possible, not at the end. It's way too late. And another belief is that roles are changing from specialized roles. We've traditionally had testing, security as well, for instance, as separate roles, often outside of the team. It's must emphasize this is becoming part of the activities that team members do, and the tester is shifting. I think it's an interesting development, and security people as well are shifting from actually doing the work to ensuring that other people do the work, so more in the facilitating and coaching role. That's something to be aware of. In terms of feelings, how will you feel after this talk? Hopefully reassured that it's a pretty natural fit for quality in DevOps. I hope you'll feel inspired to explore the area. There's some interesting stuff going on in this space. I hope you will share your thoughts on the topic, and that you'll get some satisfaction out of sharing your thoughts with the community. It's always fun to chat with your peers. And finally, the realization that you're not alone. People like us who care about these kind of things. This is what we do. So these are the learning objectives I have in mind. The agenda to guide us through the content, and I'll be pausing from time to time for you to reflect on stuff, to ask questions, to add comments. Introduction. I've got an interesting way for you to introduce yourselves. I've got 3 polls set up, which will probably confuse me because I'll have to start changing screens again. But that should give me a bit of insight into your interests, your thoughts on things. Then some opening remarks opening remarks, and then a little bit about quality assurance and testing, because that was my opportunity to rethink what are we actually talking about. And then we'll dive into DevOps, looking at its origins, its roots, some core concepts and characteristics of the domain, in particular the scope, because it's sort of depends on how you define it. It can be fairly tight, but some people like to expand it. I've got some thoughts on that. And a way of depicting DevOps in the bigger picture, which many people find useful. I did a similar but different talk yesterday evening for a group of people in business analysts in Toronto in Canada, and they found that big picture valuable. So I hope you will as well. Then talk about QA in particular in DevOps, and end up like to spend a bit of time at the end to enable you to think about what have you got out of this session, because it's not my session, it's your session, and I'm happy to contribute, but it's not going to change my life much. Hopefully it's about your work and how you can improve your work, but you're going to have to work at that. In terms of introduction, here are some of the publications that I've either written on the left-hand side, the mainly stuff that I've written, and on the right-hand side, publications I've contributed to really to illustrate the breadth of my interests. There's a bit of DevOps in there. In fact, the most relevant publication is at the bottom row, second from left, a white paper, The Business Value of DevOps. Let's get one of them from the bookshelf behind me. You can just see it there, from DASA, the DevOps Agile Skills Association. I was one of their global ambassadors for a while and did various things. And I think that's the most significant thing I did for that community. And I'm quite pleased with the results, because it translates the technical stuff that you do in DevOps into terms that business executives understand. If you're interested in more content, I wrote a couple of books recently. They're strategically positioned on my bookshelf, those pink ones. And in fact, you can see it on my I got a T-shirt made with the book printed on the T-shirt. So mad enough to do that. And not only that, I was mad enough to write a book about the book. The first book I wrote is called High Velocity IT, and the second book is and that's if you're familiar with IT service management, that's one of the new ITIL books, High Velocity IT, and it's the weirdest ITIL book that's ever been written, I'm proud to say. And I also wrote a book about the book called Reflections on High Velocity IT, which I self-published on Amazon. You can buy it for about $10. But it's if you ever consider writing a book and self-publishing, Amazon is a pretty easy way to do it. I quite enjoyed that process. If you want to buy Prince2 books and ITIL books, the publisher, TSO, has given me a discount code, AB20, that will give you 20% discount if you buy it on the TSO site with this link here. I've done some work on training as well, and the Good e-learning training organization, they've also given me a discount code, 20% off their online training courses. And in fact, I thought that was to have a discount code named after you, small e20, that that's as good as an industry award. That's like getting an Oscar. So I was quite pleased with that. A discount code named after me. And finally, if you don't want to spend any money, just have a look at my website, smalley.it, in particular the writing section, where I've summarized lots of content that you can find on DevOpsy, high velocity kind of stuff. And the learning section, that lists various topics that I'm interested in, with links to mostly to videos and things. But it's a very diverse list of stuff. Some will probably bore you to death, but other topics might interest you. But there's some stuff that you could browse around there. So that's something to take a look at. Now, as far as the interaction's concerned, just like I said a couple of minutes ago, this is your session, so you have to put the work into it. And I'd like to. This is one of my favorite quotes. Taiichi Ono is the father of the Toyota production system in Japan, which goes back decades now. And he said, you have to face your own difficulties and think for yourself. You can't borrow solutions from other people. So stop trying to borrow best practices, how another organization has solved their problems. That probably won't work for you. So you really have to work at it, and it's going to cost you energy. If you don't have the energy, fine, but otherwise nothing much is going to happen. So it's up to you. I do hope we engage. It's usually much more fun if we have some interaction. What I would suggest, if you want to get the most out of this session, is to during the session to make some observations and note any takeaways that you think might be relevant. And you could use a technique. It's a fairly old technique, but I've often used it. It's the PMI technique that Edward de Bono came up with. He's the guy who came up with the lateral thinking concept again ages ago. I think it's the 70s or 80s. And he says when you're listening to a talk or in a meeting, make a list of 3 different things. What are the positive things? What are the negative things? What are the interesting things? Things that aren't necessarily positive or negative, but just, that's interesting. I never knew that. It's a nice way to focus your thoughts. So you could think about that. In terms of interaction, we've got the chat up here, so that's good. I've got it visible at the moment before I lose it. Feel free to use the chat just to introduce yourself to your fellow attendees. Maybe you know each other, maybe you don't have to. And very shortly, I'll be launching a poll, rather 3 polls, which is an opportunity for you to introduce yourselves by telling me something about the organization that you work for. So let's dive into that. Now we're using Mentimeter, and if you log on to menti.com and use the code 23229623, then you'll sort of come into a waiting area, which is waiting for me to launch the poll. And I should tell you, because I'm using a free version of Mentimeter, I'm misusing the functionality a little bit. I'm using functionality that's actually intended to do a quiz, because that's the stuff that they had available to people who are too mean to pay for a subscription. So don't get confused if you think it's a quiz. It's not. But it went all right yesterday evening. It should go all right with you. If the Canadians can do it, Ukrainians can. So let's have a look at the 6 choices. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to look at the screen, look at the PowerPoint screen first. I'll talk you through the choices so that you can get a good understanding of what we're talking about. Then you'll have 15 seconds in the Mentimeter screen to make your choice. So make sure you know what you're going to choose before I switch to the Mentimeter. And then we'll go on to the next poll, and I'll give you feedback afterwards. I don't think that you can see the feedback yourself. I'll have to tell you what the results are. Now, the question here is, just think about your organization. And if you're a consultant working for another organization, working for a client, just think about the client that you're currently working for, or a number of clients. It doesn't really matter, but just thinking about real organizations and thinking about what's their weakest link. And I'm going to present you with 6 different potential weakest links and get you thinking about, what would I like to improve the most in order to get more value in the organization. The first choice is, are you making valuable investments with digital technology? And this is mostly about the functionality. This is about, are you building the right kind of digital products and services for your customers? Are you automating the right internal business processes? And are you automating them well? So what kind of functionality are you building? Is that something that is potentially useful? That's the first question. Are you doing the right thing to start with? Second one is, are you doing it quickly? Are you developing and delivering the functionality quickly after it's been, you've come up with an idea? How quickly can you get it into production? The third one is, how resilient is IT operations? Thinking about availability, recoverability, continuity, security, performance as well, those kind of aspects. How easy is it? Do the users have continuous access to the systems? And when things go wrong, do you recover service as quickly as possible so you minimize the disruption to business operations. That's the key point there. Now, this is interesting just to stop here. You've come up with a great idea, some kind of functionality you want. You've developed and deployed it into production quickly, and it's running well in production. So you're really satisfied. But you have to realize that up until now, absolutely no value has been realized because the users haven't used it. Because that's the next step in the poll. The concept of co-creation of value. So it's not only the IT service provider that does stuff, but the IT service consumer has a role to play. They have to think about these things. I advise you to think about them quite seriously in your organization. Do you know your users? That's a good question. I hope you do. Who uses the systems? Do they know what kind of functionality is available? Do they use the functionality? Do they use it effectively? Do they understand the data that's being presented to them? Can they interpret the data correctly? Do they use that data to improve decision making? Because that's really the function of information, is to reduce uncertainty so you can take better decisions. And finally, assuming that you've looked at the data, understood what it, you've used the application, you've got the data out of it, you understand it, you interpret the data, you make a better decision. Until somebody acts on that decision that's been improved by better information, no value's been realized. So this is in some I might dare to say in most organizations, this is neglected, because the question is, who is responsible for effective use, value realization? And that's the fourth part. The fifth one is about all of the above, all of those first four aspects. Can you assure conformance to whatever governance, risk, and compliance requirements apply in your organization, your industry, your country? And finally, the sixth choice to think about, so think about what's your weakest link. The efficiency of the solution. What does it cost in terms of money, but also effort? This is not the business savings that the solution possibly makes, but what it costs to design, to develop, to operate, the total life cycle costs of the information system that we're talking about. So the total cost of IT, really, that's the thing. So assuming that you, and I deliberately took quite a long while to go through this and to elaborate on a couple of points, particularly number 1 and number 4, because I think they needed a bit of elaboration. So I hope you understand the points. I'd like you now to make up your minds. What is your weakest link? And I will try to activate the Mentimeter app, if I can get my cursor onto the right screen. And forgive me while I just play around with this. Yeah, I think it's working now. I think in a matter of seconds. Oh no, I've got to hit enter. I think that you will now have, almost now, coming up now shortly, you should now have the opportunity to make your choice. Five seconds to go. And choose what is. All right, now make a note of that. So we've got 2/3 going for fast development and 1/3 for resilient operations. So thanks for that. So speed and resilient operations, there are your concerns. And now I will go back to the PowerPoint and move on to the next poll. Now, thinking about those improvements that you'd like to make, in order to make those improvements, do you think that you can do that fairly easily? Is that an improvement you can make without radically changing how things are organized around IT? Or do you think that you need to change the operating model? With the operating model, I mean the combination of people and information systems and organizational structure, processes, policies, that kind of stuff. So operating model is really, that defines the parts of the organization that you work for, defines how you produce your products and services. So is it a question of, that's the question here for the next poll, is it a fairly relatively easy improvement without changing the whole structure of the organization and the people and the job profiles, for instance? Or do you need a radical rethink? So I'll move on to the next poll. Right, I think it's coming up now. I hope so. Ten, 8, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1. Right, radical rethink. Thank you for that. Now, moving back to the screen. The next and final question is, and it's this can be quite tricky. I often ask this question of people, and most people find it quite difficult to assess. The question is, if you look at your total IT costs in an organization, what percentage are they of the total business costs? So total costs of your whole organization, how much of that expressed in a percentage is IT? And that's including internal staff and external staff. So first think about the question, do you actually know how much you spend on IT as a percentage of the total business costs? And if you do, is it 5% or less, about 10%, about 20%, about 30%, more than 40%? These are just rough figures, but it gives you an idea of how significant IT costs are. So have a think about that. The first part is easy. Either you know it or you don't. And if you do, be interested. And it depends very much on the industry that you're in. If you work, for instance, for an airline, your IT costs are going to be relatively low because aircraft cost an awful lot, and fuel costs a lot as well. So let's get the final one started. Ten seconds to go. 5. Yeah, okay, don't know, and 5% or less. They're the highest scores. Great. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, that the 5% or less. That's probably an industry that's pretty capital intensive. So an airline where you got expensive things. If you look at a retail bank, for instance, it's probably around the 30s, might even be more. Right, so that was the poll stuff done. I'll get that out of my screen so that I can see you better, or at least follow the presentation that I'm presenting. Now, this is just for reference. I did it last night for IIBA in Toronto, and there are the results. Just like you said, fast development and resilient operations, they scored pretty high there. But they scored co-created value, so how effectively the users are using the systems, even higher. And the week before, I did a session for Finland. They were pretty good with resilient operations, but placed the emphasis on fast development, co-created value again, so the users, but also the efficiency of the solution. And if you look at the costs there, you can see that most people simply don't know how much their organization spends on IT. Depending on the role that you have, I think it's a good idea to have a perspective on that, because certainly when you talk to business decision makers, you should be aware of how significant IT costs are compared to other things. So that's I'll add the results of this evening to this chart. I'll publish it on LinkedIn, and I'll continue to update this. This is only something I've started fairly recently, last couple of months. It'll be interesting to follow this over time and see what the major concerns are, and in particular that final question on the screen here: is a radical rethink needed, or can you just sort of make gradual improvements? Okay, so thanks for that. Very much appreciate your input. That's what I get out of these sessions, information like this. Opening remarks. This is probably more about quality assurance than testing, but probably more about DevOps than QA for that matter. As I mentioned, it's also about the bigger picture. I think that's useful for you to get a better understanding of the significance of DevOps in the bigger picture. It's certainly not about tools. If you are interested in tools, though, have a look at what's called the periodic table of DevOps tools. They update this regularly, and it's a great collection. Of course, you can't read it here; it's way too small, but you get the picture. And if you look at the bottom row in blue on the left-hand side, light blue, they are tools that are related to testing. So you could, I can just about read Cucumber on one of the tools there. I'm not a tool person at all, but if you're interested, that's an excellent source of all of the different kinds of tools which are frequently used in the DevOps domain, and that those categories also give you an idea of the kind of categories that are important in DevOps. So that's good to have. Okay, QA and testing. This is a bit of a weird comparison, but it's something that made a deep impression on me, and I'll tell you why in a minute. It's when you're tightening a nut or a bolt with a spanner, you go through various phases. There's what people call finger tight. You sort of tighten it up with your finger, and then you can't tighten it up anymore. You've got contact, but you don't really take up the elasticity in the metal. That's the next stage. You could call it snug. It's not completely tight, but it's sort of pretty firm. You've taken up the easy elasticity. And then you have tight. You sort of reach the point where you think, yeah, that's good. And the next point is you broke it. You stripped the thread. You went way too far. Probably a big wrench, a big spanner that you used, and you strip the thread. And the interesting thing about quality is quality is tight, and it's knowing what tight is. And tight is not broke, and tight is not snug. Tight is tight. But try and explain that to somebody. Some things just require a mechanic's feel. referred to. And if you haven't dealt with these kind of things, you probably don't have that feeling. So some things you really need to experience in real life to understand. Now, this comes from a book ages ago, 1974, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, which I read when I was probably mid-20s. It was really, really great. It made very deep impression on me. It's listed as one of the sort of seminal books on the topic of quality. And it's a lovely book in the sense that it's a story about a father and a son on a motorcycle making a trip, but at the same time an exploration of quality, so a bit of theory. And it's very similar to another book that I'd highly recommend, The Goal, Eli Goldratt, about the theory of constraints, which is about the weakest link. The theory of constraints says you should always be working on the weakest link, otherwise you're suboptimal. And another book, and that's also a narrative, a story with theory woven into the story. I remember vividly, I started reading that book mid-afternoon. I think I stopped at 2 o'clock in the morning. Absolutely great, well-written, very interesting. Again, seminal work. I think 1984, I think 82 or 84. More recently, the Phoenix Project. If you have heard of DevOps, you are likely to have heard of the Phoenix Project. And again, that's a similar kind of thing. It's a story about a factory and people doing stuff, things going wrong. So it's a combination of a great story, a great narrative, and theory woven into it. So you got 3 books to consider, and certainly the Phoenix, certainly the last 2, the Phoenix Project and the Goal. The Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance is more an acquired taste, I think, and it might be too old now, but I got a lot out of it. And certainly that concept of quality, you feel when it's right. You can't explain it, but you feel it. You've got to know these kind of things. Now, testing and QA. If testing is about detecting defects, then QA is about preventing them, avoiding problems, also providing people with confidence that that things will turn out well in the end, that requirements will be fulfilled. So mostly administrative and procedural activities, not really technical activities, based on fitness for purpose and right first time, 2 of the core concepts in QA. And this, I found this interesting to explore a little bit more. Fitness for purpose. Do the products and services fulfill the requirements? It's pretty basic stuff. You come up to expectations. But the next question is, are the requirements right? So are you testing the requirements as well? Have all of the stakeholders been consulted? Do they know what they want, what they need? Can they know what they want? Is it realistic to expect that people, in a dynamic environment, is it realistic to expect that people can specify exactly what they want? And if not, what do you do then from a QA perspective? The other major point, right first time, it's more about the processes, less about the product. The process being executed according to how they were designed. And similarly to with requirements, not only have the requirements, have you got the right requirements, but have you got the right processes? Similarly, can the processes be designed correctly? Once again, if you're talking about a fairly dynamic environment where things emerge, behavior emerges, is it realistic to expect that you can predefine how things are going to happen? And when you're in that emergent environment, what do you do then when things are unpredictable? So that's with lots of these talks. I don't have the answers, but I have interesting questions. Well, I hope I have interesting questions for you to think about. So let's have a look at the scope of QA. All very basic stuff, but it's good. I think it's good. It was certainly good for me to think about these things and sort of put some markers down. We're talking about fitness for purpose. That refers not only to the system that gets built, but also to the requirements that you start with. And right first time refers to the process of development, the activities. And you could expand that if you double click on double click on development. You could see the various stages in development. You come up with a design for the code, you code it, you go into integration, delivery, deployment into production. At all of these stages, there's something to do with quality there. So these are all aspects you have to consider. Back to the original version of the diagram. Not only are we looking at development, but also there's a prequel to this as well. Before you come up with requirements, there's a process of somebody having an idea. We need to change something in the business. We need to make something more efficient or improve the engagement with customers, for instance. Depends very much on the functionality. But somebody comes up with an idea to invest in IT, and they have a hypothesis. If we do this, then this will happen. Is it plausible? Yeah, I think it's going to work. Well, let's invest in it. So you do some analysis, business analysis, for instance. You come up with the requirements, and then the development process starts. Now, that before you come up with the requirements, that could have taken years for people to realize that something actually had to change. So it's interesting to take a longer term look at this. Equally, there's a sequel to development. Once the system is in production, as I mentioned, people have got to use it, get information out of it, use the information in business operations. The operation part here is business operations, and derive value from the investment. So these are all areas that you could apply quality assurance to. But that's not all. In order to perform these activities, you need people and organizations, information and technology, partners and suppliers. You could say these are 3 or 6 kinds of resources that you need to go through that value stream. You've got to apply quality assurance to that as well. Have you got the right kind of people with the right kind of skills? What about the partners that you work with? And you can also apply quality assurance to the whole process of governance and management, and you're managing not only performance, but also improvement. I think they're the main areas. So that's also a topic that you could you think about quality, and think about quality in the whole environment, really. So it does get you thinking about what's the scope of quality assurance. And with that, that's the first stage, where I will now have to try and find the chat, which I seem to have lost, to see if you. No, I had this problem yesterday evening finding the chat after I started it up. So please put something in the chat with the hope. Oh, I think I found it here. I hope that I can find well, I can find Q&A, but that's not it. Where's the chat? Otherwise, I'm going to briefly stop sharing and see if the chat emerges. Yeah, I can see the chat now, and I can see that nobody seems to have entered anything in the chat, which is fine. Yeah, okay, fine. Not now. It's great. Yeah, don't feel obliged. I just want to give you the opportunity, and I'll be doing this a couple of times during the session, just pausing from time to time. If you'd like to chat, it's fine. And I will now continue. Yeah, I think we're back on track now. Right. So the next section. Good. We're now getting into the meat of the presentation, looking at DevOps itself. I hope you found that prequel, despite the fact that it wasn't about DevOps. I hope you found that useful. This sounds a bit weird, but it is, believe me, it is relevant. I'm talking about belief systems. We all have belief systems. We tell ourselves stories about the world, and we believe these stories, and that's how we survive on a day-to-day basis. Um, so you got this belief system, and somebody comes up with a new belief system. Let's call it DevOps. You can get various reactions to belief systems. I could give you a couple of extremes. One is that you say, this is no good at all. This is heresy. I don't believe this is evil. I'm going to ignore this, and I'm going to continue with my old belief system. The opposite is that you say this is received truth. This is gospel. I've been waiting for this enlightenment for years. I'm going to follow the script to the letter, and that's too extreme for my feelings. That's fundamentalism, dogmatism. It's probably not a good thing to follow things to the letter. And somewhere in between, there are various options in between, but something in between that makes more sense to me is some kind of skeptical adoption of a new paradigm, a new belief system, realizing that it will evolve over time, it will change over time, and that you shouldn't take it too literally. Always bear in mind the pragmatic value of something. And from time to time, as things develop, you'll get people disagreeing with each other and saying, "No, I've got a different interpretation to your interpretation." So you get reformations, different churches, if you look at it in a religious context. And some of these things are like religions. These people are very much meaning-seeking beings and belonging-seeking beings. You like to have some kind of identity. You like to belong to a certain group with a certain belief system. It's just how things work. So we're talking really about DevOps as a new belief system. You could also think about DevOps. I made this as a joke at first, but there's a bit of truth in there. If you look at DevOps as a medication, it used to be a pill, but I've changed it to a vaccination to keep up with modern trends. So we've got DevOps as a vaccination. If you look at the box on medication, you see, what's it for? I say this is for organizations that suffer from IT constipation. The flow isn't good. And the effect of applying DevOps is that it improves the flow through the organization. But it has side effects as well. If you use it, don't use it wisely, it might cause severe headaches. You've often, with medication, you've often got the contraindication. Don't use this if you're pregnant, for instance. Don't take this if you're pregnant because it's not, or if you suffer from high blood pressure or whatever. So in this case, I think in DevOps, not suitable for highly bureaucratic organizations. If the organization thinks in silos, and that's just the way they do things, then you're not going to get the most value out of DevOps. And because DevOps relies on a high degree of automation, if the kind of IT infrastructure is not easy to automate, we're talking about stuff like CI/CD pipelines, continuous integration, continuous deployment pipelines, you probably won't get much value out of it. And as with all frameworks, keep out of reach of framework fundamentalists, these kind of things. You can apply this paradigm to anything you like. You probably apply it to testing as well, or QA. Now let's take a look at DevOps. It's what's the nature of DevOps? It's a community. It's a movement. I think it's one of the most significant movements that I've experienced in 40 years in IT. It's a set of principles, so it represents a way of thinking about things. In that sense, you could say it's a paradigm, it's a belief system, but it also comprises a set of practices, which is more about a way of working. A way of thinking, way of working. Different way of thinking, a different way of working than traditionally. You think about the scope as well in terms of not only the activities, but also the stakeholders, who's involved in DevOps things, which processes are involved, the activities, and which artifacts, which parts. If you think about the stack of an information system, you used to have the old OC 7-layer model. I used to say that the OC 7-layer model, that you should have 3 extra layers. It was what was it? Money. I forget what the third. I can only remember 2 of them. One of them was money, and one was religion. I think money, politics, religion. I think those were the 3 layers that you should put on top of the OC model. But think about, are we talking about the infrastructure, hardware? Is it just software? Is it about requirements? Those kind of artifacts. And it's a good question to ask yourself, what is not DevOps? Because people often say, we do DevOps. Ask them what is not DevOps, and you'll get a better understanding of what they understand. And it's really a critical question to ask. When somebody says DevOps, what do they mean by it? And I'll come to that in a moment. It's good to understand where DevOps, how it emerged. Guy called Patrick Dubois, one of the most generous people in the community that I know. He was playing around with the idea of, he saw what software people were doing with Agile. This was sort of 2008, 9, around that time. He was thinking, why can't we apply that kind of flow, agile stuff to infrastructure? And he thought, we should do something with this. And he organized a conference, the first DevOps Days conference, and he had to come up with a name for the conference. He had a sort of a work in progress name, a working title. He was talking about agile system administration as the concept of what he was thinking about, but it's a bit of a long name, a bit clunky name. So he called it DevOps by accident, because he had to come up with a name for the conference, DevOps Days, sort of short name. So don't try and look for some kind of mystical meaning in those 6 letters, DEVOPS. It's a name he came up by accident. And he emphasized it's about putting the fun back into IT. And this I'm wearing for this occasion, I'm wearing a very significant T-shirt. It's the 10th anniversary of the initial DevOps conference in Ghent, in Belgium. Patrick's a Belgian. You can see on the right-hand side of the chart here, you can see DevOps as a natural progression of the Agile movement, where Agile, and certainly if you speak Scrum, if you think in Scrum terms, Scrum stops with potentially shippable software increments. So the developer's done their job, developed something, is potentially shippable, but it's not shipped yet. DevOps extends that. So you can see DevOps as a progression from Agile. You can see lots of lean thinking in Agile, and the same applies to DevOps. And DevOps has been influenced by multiple other movements, which I've listed here, just to give you an idea of the background behind it, and to emphasize that fun part as well. Now, I'm going to give you 3 basic concepts that help to characterize what DevOps is and is not, and where the emphasis is in DevOps. You'll find many variations of this infinity loop around. I've chosen one of the variations you come across quite a lot. And it symbolizes the continuous nature of things. You develop stuff, it goes into production, it gets changed, it goes back and forth. And it's not with stage gates in between, but it's a sort of continuous flow. That's the idea. If you look a little bit more closely, you'll see that the emphasis is when the developer has finished developing So when you've got potentially shippable software, then it starts to get interesting because people talk about CI/CD pipelines, continuous integration, delivery and deployment pipelines, automating that part, getting it into production as quickly as possible, instead of having to wait weeks, possibly longer, for IT operations to say, we're now going to release stuff, you have to wait until then. Instead of that, the idea is to release as frequently and quickly and reliably as possible. And this is for many people in DevOps the main emphasis. In the discussion with the business analysts yesterday evening, they were asking, where's business analysis in this? It's probably hidden somewhere in plan. Maybe monitor. You could say, monitor is observing what's going on in the organization, so not monitoring from a technical sense, but functionally what's going on, and translating that into plans, hypotheses, requirements, things that have to be built. So you can see that the DevOps community speaks mostly about the things that they are interested in and less about the things they're not interested in. Of course, that's the nature of a model. With a model, you select some things and you deselect other things. So that's a major concept in DevOps. Another major concept is the abbreviation CALMS, sometimes CLAMS, same letters, about culture, that concept of breaking down silos, heavy emphasis on automation, automate as much as possible. Sorry. Application of lean principles, small batches of work. That's very important to get the flow and get quick feedback. Measurement and metrics. They're very data driven. It's really the application of the scientific method and blameless improvement. So when things go wrong, you don't blame people that things went wrong. You don't look at the person, you look at the system that caused somebody to take the wrong decision. And the final point is sharing experience across teams in an organization, but also across organizations. There's a very healthy conference scene, DevOps stage, of course, in Ukraine being one of the major conferences, and a great event. So it's good as well, that sharing. So calms, and people do often focus too much on the tools. There's lots of technical people in DevOps, and they have to be reminded from time to time. It's about people as well. Think about the culture. Finally, as the third major concept, the three ways of DevOps, represented usually with that little symbol down the bottom, with 3 lines, well, slightly more than 3 lines, one from left to right, symbolizing the fast flow of work from dev to ops. The second one symbolizing feedback from right to left, as quickly as possible, getting good, frequent, fast feedback so you can adjust things. And the little circles in the middle representing continuous learning and improvement. That's one of the core parts, the core tenets, foundations of DevOps. So there you've got three core concepts which help you hopefully understand what it is. And a thing that came up yesterday evening that I think it's a nice analogy. It's a bit like DHL or FedEx or whoever, UPS, whoever delivers your packages. DHL isn't really interested in the content of the box. Their job is to shift the box as quickly as possible. Now, for many DevOps people, they have a similar kind of attitude to the work. It's not about the functionality. It's about that's just a given. Somebody else has determined the functionality. Some developer has developed the functionality. The main job is to get it shipped as quickly as possible into production. So it's shipping the boxes. And what's in the box is less relevant. Word of warning here, this does very much depend on how you interpret DevOps. There will be DevOps people who also are interested in the functionality. But if you look at the technical practices in the DevOps handbook, which I'll introduce you to in a moment, you'll see that most of the technical practices are about really that yellow area here. So that's something to be aware of. Now, speaking of the DevOps handbook, I mentioned the Phoenix project earlier. After that came the DevOps handbook, which is a much more structured and instrumental way of looking at DevOps. It comprises principles, practices, cultural norms as well, describing DevOps. After that came Accelerate, which is a pretty good book. They're all from the same family of authors, and most recently the Unicorn project, which is a similar kind of book. You could say it's a sequel to the Phoenix project, same kind of story and theory combined, whereas the other two are more about theory. John Willis, one of the co-authors of the DevOps handbook, says, if you want to sum it up, it's about continuous delivery and it's about culture. That's the main thing about DevOps. And that really, I think that emphasizes that that yellow line I drew through the infinity loop, and it emphasizes the culture of team effort, breaking down the silos. Done means released. You may be familiar with the agile concept, the definition of done. When is the work finished? It's often finished, as I mentioned, in Scrum. It's finished when something is potentially shippable. John says, no, it's done when it's released. I'd like to extend it even further. I say it's done when people have achieved realized value out of the investment. The third one is a very interesting cultural aspect. Stop the line when it breaks. This refers to the andon chord, which you'll come across in the Toyota production system, car manufacturing. So, you're working on a manufacturing line, building cars, manufacturing cars. You're responsible for part of a line. You see the cars coming past. You see there's a defect in one of the cars. You don't let it go down the line. You pull the andon cord. You stop production. Can you imagine stopping production in your organization? The first thing that the team leader does, the person responsible for that part of the system, he comes to the operator, and to typical Japanese, bows to the operator and says, "Thank you for stopping production." Now, can you imagine that? Your manager saying, "Thank you for stopping production." You're all these customers waiting. Because the idea, this is about a different way of thinking, different cultural norms, different belief system. The core belief is, the sooner you identify and fix quality issues, the cheaper it is, and the less effort other people have to do to fix it further down the line. So that's that concept of addressing things as soon as possible. The shift left mentality as well is in there. So that's something to think about. Now in yellow or orange here, I've summed up. I'm not going to deal with these, but just mention that they're included in the slide deck. A summary of some key parts of the DevOps handbook, illustrating the principles for this is the first way of DevOps, fast flow of work. You can see some lean principles in there, work in progress, batch sizes, reduced number of handoffs. Principles for the second way of DevOps, fast, frequent, and good feedback. The principles for the third way of DevOps, continuous experimentation, learning, and improvement. And although there isn't a fourth way of DevOps, there is to a degree. And I think this is relevant for testing as well, because one of the core parts of DevOps, the idea is that you integrate the work which has traditionally been separated from the daily work of developers and operators You've got change management, change advisory boards and information security officers and compliance officers. What you try to do is to get that work integrated into the daily work of everybody. So you see that you can imagine the change in roles from a security officer checking security to ensuring that other people do that as part of their job. And I think that's a key point to be aware of in DevOps. So I like to call that the fourth way of DevOps, but that's just my way of looking at it. I've summed up many characteristics, concepts and characteristics in DevOps, which will give you a flavor of the kind of topics that DevOps addresses. Just pick on a couple: high trust culture, psychological safety in the workplace, so people feel comfortable in expressing their doubts about things when they're concerned. The concept of loosely coupled architecture, so that you can have fairly small teams that can work relatively independently of other teams because the system architecture is divided up similarly. You can refer back to this. I've also summed up some cultural norms. I've already mentioned a couple of these. It's good just to be aware of the final one, a generative culture. That refers to work done by Dr. Ron Westrom. A while ago now, he categorized organizations into three kinds: pathological, bureaucratic, and generative. Pathological organizations are really evil. Have a look at the characteristics here. When something fails, they try and cover up the disaster. Bureaucratic isn't that evil, but is not really highly productive. And a generative culture is something that you have when when people feel comfortable sharing. When you talk about the system rather than individuals. Reference to further reading there if you're interested. So that's more for reference if you're interested. Now I'm going to stop sharing once again, if I can find out how to stop sharing, so you have the opportunity, if you care to interact. And it's surprising how easily I can lose my cursor. Oh, there it is. Right, I think we've got the thing back now. Yeah. I just take the opportunity to drink a bit more of my cold tea. I expect you've all fallen asleep at this time of day, particularly if you've eaten. I've delayed eating. Just on a personal note, I'm joining you from just outside Amsterdam in the Netherlands, where I've lived for, gosh, like 42 years now. After I was born in London in the UK and emigrated early 20s, and it's and we've got an hour's difference, 10 past 7 in the evening here. Right, no questions. I think you're all asleep. So I'll go back to continuing the session. And a critical part, because it again, it gives you a better feeling of what DevOps is if you understand how people measure how successful they are. And typically, you'll come across 4 kinds of metrics. Time after time, people use these metrics to compare how well they are doing compared to other organizations. 3 of them are related to development, 1 more to operations. Deployment frequency, so how quickly do you ship stuff? Use the DHL analogy. How quickly do you ship packages into production? How often do you ship? sorry, that's the first one. How often do you ship, frequency, speed of deployment, and how well do the deployments go? Is it delivered properly each time, or does something go wrong? And the final one, which is more ops related, is when things go wrong, how long does it take to get the service up and running again? So the mean time to recover normal service, so you have minimal business disruption. You'll come across these things. Now, this is, if you look at the annual State of DevOps report, which is easy enough to find online, you'll find these questions. I've included how they're formulated, in particular to draw your attention to the second metric. How long does it take to go from code commit to code successfully running in production? Just want to emphasize that code commit part. That's when the developer has done developing, says, I'm good. The package, the box, the box with DHL is ready to be shipped. So we're talking about the time from when the developer's developed until it's in production, that scope. Now, if we look at these four metrics, and if we compare them with the 6 potential weakest links that we did in that first poll, you'll see that the first 2 of these metrics refer to fast development and deployment, and that the second 2 refer certainly to resilient operations, possibly to efficiency of the solution, but I wouldn't advise anybody to adopt DevOps if they want to save money. You might end up spending more money on IT, but getting more value. I think you should look at the value rather than the cost. So here, but I'd like to emphasize here with the explanation, the statement that this is an interpretation of DevOps. Other people may have broader interpretations, but most interpretations, and certainly if you use these kind of metrics, it's not about the quality, not about the functionality, not about what's in the box, and not about what people do when they've opened the box and used the product that they received. So it's not about valuable investments. It's not about co-created value. It's certainly about assured conformance. That's in there somewhere. That's because that work has been integrated into the daily work of developers and operators. Now, if you're interesting, I think I'm not going to do a poll on this, but you can do this for yourself. Just think about your own organization. How often do you deploy code for a particular application? So every month, week, quarter? How long does it take when a developer has finished developing a feature? How long does it take for it to get into production, and the other 2 as well? And then you can compare it to these results. These are the categories that the State of DevOps report uses. They've been doing this for several years now. They started off with 3 categories, high, medium, and low, but they've now introduced a higher elite category within high, which is for the very advanced organizations who can deploy on demand, and where they take less than an hour to deploy code, where some organizations, particularly traditional bureaucratic kind of organizations, will deploy possibly once a month, once a quarter, because they're nervous about the possible damage that you'll do when you implement new code. And that's that's a sort of that's a clash in belief system. Traditionally, IT service management believed change is bad, so we want to restrict change as much as possible, try and control it as much as possible, reduce the number of times that we change the system. Whereas modern thinking says, if you reduce the size of the batches, the size of the changes, very much in line with lean thinking, a smaller change will have less risk. And the more often you make changes, the better you will become, the better capabilities you will develop, in order in that whole change process. So you'll be able to make changes better because you do them more often. If you only change once every quarter, then you sort of forget what happened last quarter. But if you're doing it every week or every day, even, you get into a rhythm, a pattern of doing things pretty reliably. So it's good to think about where you are on this scale. Now, if you sum this up in terms of value, I think you should be thinking about value. It's about what's the value of DevOps, and I'm referring to that white paper that I wrote. Faster delivery of more resilient, possibly cheaper IT with a happier workforce. That's the that's the bottom line. That's not something you can explain to business executives. You have to translate that into more sales, higher prices, fewer disruptions to business operations. But that's something I explore in that white paper. So if you want to talk about these things with business people, have a look at the paper. You might find it interesting. If you think about that in terms of how HPO stands for high performance organization, how a high performance organization provides services that deliver value. You can look at service from 3 dimensions. You can say we have good, cheap, and fast service. You may have come across the sign saying we have 3 kinds of service. You can choose any 2. Good and cheap service won't be fast. Cheap and fast service won't be good, and so on. That's the iron triangle that people often refer to. It's a good way of looking at things. But if you look at good, you can break that down into fitness for purpose and fitness for use. Fitness for purpose is often called utility, the usefulness, which in terms of a business, you build a digital solution. It can improve the image of your organization. It can improve your sales. Depending on the kind of functionality, it can improve prices. It can reduce business costs, capital expenditure and operational expenditure. Together, they represent value. The warranty dimension of good is about that stuff like availability and resilience. That's about reducing the risk that those components of business value will be impacted negatively. Look at cheap. Cheap IT reduces operational expenditure and capital expenditure. But as we did with that third poll, it's good to be aware of how significant the cost reduction is. And finally, speed in itself is nothing. It's about the speed with which you deliver the functionality and therefore get the benefits and, of course, incur the costs. So this really sums up the major components in that white paper without you having to read it. Any comments on that before we move on to the section about QA and DevOps? Right, let's continue. Yep, back again. Oh yeah, no, almost forgot the bigger picture. This is something that I've been working on for years and for years. I don't know how many variations of this picture I've drawn, but this is my latest one, and presented it for the first time yesterday evening, and now for the second time with you. Is taking it very much taking a high level view of organizations, zooming in from really high level. This is an organization. This is a bank, for instance, where they execute banking activities. That the bank needs to be governed, and governance is about directing the CEO of the bank what to do, monitoring how they perform, and evaluating how they perform, and redirecting the CEO. Because we're talking about non-executive governance here. This is the governing board, who don't do any execution stuff. They don't run the business. They govern the business. Is the CEO, who is just a manager in the eyes of the governing board, and of course lots of managers underneath the CEO. It's up to the manager up to the CEO to run the business. And they govern in terms of, they could give the manager, CEO, goals and resources, amount of money to do stuff. They also apply constraints, boundaries within these limits, with these policies. You can act. They monitor not only process, but mostly outcomes, compare outcomes with desired objectives. We often talk about the triple P, people, planet, profit. Which objectives are you trying to achieve, and you adjust the direction accordingly. So that's what we call governance. So we've positioned that. Let's take a look at the organization itself. Within the organization, you've got operations in the middle, the green part, and you've got management. But management is not only about managing performance, but also about managing improvement. So I've got improvement in there. Let's zoom down further in. The actual execution is about who you serve, what you do, the products and services that you provide, and how you do it. You could say this is the business model of the organization. This comprises the customers, the market segments that you address, the relations with customers, the channels through which customers interact with you. It's about your products and services, and it's about the resources, activities, and partners that you use to deliver the products and services. And you could say through that runs a value stream. And I'd like to take a look at that value stream, which I divided up into 4 segments. Starting in business operations, somebody is using an automated information system, a digital solution, getting information out of it, getting data out of it, and using that data to take better actions. Those actions result in results, outcomes. Those outcomes, those results, can be a trigger for business planning to think about, how can we improve things? So they come up with a hypothesis, which you can translate into requirements and specifications so that software development can build stuff, and so that it can be deployed into operations, IT operations. Systems are changed, the new systems run, and IT operations gives the users access to the systems. So we now close the circle. This is the big picture. Now let's position DevOps in there. I'd like to position it, and you could stretch it a bit, position it primarily in the deployment area. A bit of development, a bit of operations, but primarily that deployment part. That's the main part. With IT service management on the back end, on the right-hand side, and with agile software development on the left-hand side. And you could add business analysis in there as well. So these are sort of 4 dominant domains you'll come across in IT, and of course quality runs through all of them. But you'll notice on the right-hand side, that's more about the business. That also deserves our attention, I'd say. So that's possibly something that you could think about as well. Now, bringing that back to that picture I shared earlier. So we're talking about DevOps, talking about the development part, and in particular, when the developer's done with coding until it's in production. So that's given you the biggest picture I could come up with, and position DevOps as a small but important part, and it's important because the deployment is often the weakest link, that's sort of stopping the flow. But that's what it focuses on. Now I'm going to continue into the next section, assuming that you're still asleep, into testing in DevOps, testing QA. I haven't been that precise in making the distinction between the two. But certainly looking at testing, it's just like security and compliance, change management. It's the tendency is to integrate testing as much as possible into the daily work of dev and ops people, and automate it where possible, make it part of the CI/CD pipeline. So people often talk about automated testing. Can be good, can be, you know, some things you can automate, some things you've got to think carefully about whether you do that or not. But also the concept of testing in production is very common in these high velocity environments in which you come across things like DevOps, using I'm sure many of you will be familiar with the terms canary releases, A/B testing, feature toggles where you can turn functionality on and off. I gather that new functionality is often deployed in New Zealand, first of all, when you're talking about international deployment, because it's, you know, it's a relatively small country, so it doesn't do, if something goes wrong, not many people are affected. It's in a different time zone. So let's try it out in New Zealand, see if it works there. And if it works, let's turn it on for the rest of the world. Apparently, it sounds like a joke, but apparently that happens quite a lot. And the concept of chaos engineering, which sounds absolutely scary. There's something called a chaos monkey, which is, and there's a whole family of monkeys, chaos gorillas as well. The chaos monkey, which is a bit of software that tries to disable production components of the infrastructure. What? So you let a piece of software loose on your production environment with the intent of destroying parts? Yes, because the idea is that it's going to happen anyway. Sometime or other, something's going to go wrong. So try and force that to go wrong and make sure that your organization can respond quickly, because you're building the resilient, not only the resilience of the technical system, but the resilience of the whole organization. Because unexpected things happen, you have to respond quickly. So this is something that that happens quite a lot in these kind of environments. Now, I've given you a couple of sources there. The Ministry of Testing is a professional organization, knowledge sharing organization that has a lot of knowledge about testing. They organize conferences as well. And Dan Ashby contributed to one of the books I wrote. He wrote a lovely piece about that. And I'm just going to check my email, because I was in touch with Dan earlier this afternoon, asking whether he could contribute something to the. Yes, he sent me something. So let me have a look. Yeah, well, I just yeah, he's a couple of things Dan recommends. One is on his own site, which is danashby.co.uk. He's got an article or a blog called Continuous Testing in DevOps. And and he's got he references a good book by Katrina Cloakey, who I believe has spoken for you in the past, if I'm correct, in one of your communities. Her book is called Testing in DevOps, and she uses a bit of Dan's model there. Speaking of Dan, this is the link to his blog. this is one of the figures that you'll find a lot when people are talking about testing in DevOps, emphasizing that you test all over the place, all of the parts. I added to that, and who tests the testing? So that's also something to think about. How far do you go in the scope of what you test? So thinking about, so that's more about testing. This is more about QA. Just like we've got stuff like DevSecOps, in which security is embedded into DevOps, the daily activities. People talk about DevQAOps, where quality is built in, it's shifted left. And that shift from role profiles, from job profiles, from actually doing the work to enabling the work. And in general, you're seeing a tendency in these kind of teams, which are often product-based rather than project-based, product, more permanent teams, where people have multiple roles. So it's not a specialized role, somebody who only does testing or only does design or only does coding, but people do multiple things. We talk about T-shaped profiles, or pi, the Greek letter symbol pi, with two specializations, or comb-shaped, the comb, haircut, which I don't need a hair comb, where you've got multiple prongs, multiple people who can do many things. You're seeing that multidisciplinary way of approaching work. That's something to be aware of as well. Now, this is closely related to the second and third ways of DevOps, that fast and frequent feedback. That's all about getting feedback as quickly as possible, shift left, and also paying attention to the improvement of the whole organization. So that's not really looking at the products, but more looking at the process and the quality of the process. Thinking about these kind of things, thinking about fostering a culture. Is this part of the QA domain, or is it organizational development? It's an interesting question. Somebody should be paying attention to it. It might be interesting if in QA, if you're seeing, or in testing, if you're seeing work shifting from doing the work to facilitating and coaching the work, maybe that's an opportunity to take on other stuff as well. So you could certainly think about expanding the scope of your QA activities. So think about, it could be an extension of your QA domain. Think about fostering the adoption of DevOps principles, practices, cultural norms. Monitor not only the 4 technical metrics that I presented, but think, and this is something you might not have come across before, the concept of narratives as objectives. Sounds a bit strange. It's about the stories that that people tell about their organization. When you're getting a cup of coffee, a couple of people meet and start complaining about the organization, what's gone wrong now, again. So what people tell their friends about the organization, would they recommend their organization as a place to work? Sorry. So what you can do from an improvement perspective, and this is more from an organizational improvement perspective. So if you're interested in expanding the scope of QA to include these kind of aspects, think about thinking in terms of, we want more stories like these about the organization and fewer stories like these. So you're thinking about the kind of stories that people tell about your organization. There's a great thing about these kind of metrics, because some metrics are notoriously susceptible to people gaming the system, people deliberately focusing on getting the number just above a certain level in order to get their bonus, but to the detriment of other metrics. Now, if you think about the kind of stories that you want people to tell about the organization, you can't play those games. So that is often referred to as a vector objective, because it's more about a direction that you want to be moving towards. This certainly is worth considering. There's a guy called Dave Snowden, who's one of the cleverest guys that I know. He refers to this quite a lot. The concept of it's certainly in complex environments where you can't predict what's going to happen, you can't control what's going to happen. It emerges over time. So you do experiments, but you're monitoring what kind of stories people are telling about the organization. I have almost come to the end of the session, so I think I'll combine this with the final section, and see. And again, I'll stop sharing so I can look at the chat to see what you have got out of the session and what you plan to do, if at all, when you get back to work tomorrow. Oh, I see a comment here. I think that refers to Katerina Clokey. Yeah, she wrote the book quite a while ago now, I think. I think she's moved on to doing other things, but it still seems to be a pretty valuable piece of work. At the end of the slide deck, which I'm not planning to present, but I've made a note of stuff I came across in during the preparation of this talk. I've made lots of notes of about references that you could follow up, and possibly look into. And I've also I listened to a very good podcast from two people who are really into testing in the Agile and DevOps environment, and made some notes during that podcast. I've recorded those notes on slide as well, so you can take a look at those at your leisure, assuming that you have access to the presentation. I'll just after we've done with the presentation, I'll just click through the slides shortly so they're on the recording, so you can look back at the recording if it's available, or look at the slide deck if it's made available. Yeah, okay, right. In that case, I will proceed. I've got to get controls back. There we are. I've just got one thing to share with you. Yeah, well, just remind you of that, of those wise words. You really have to put the effort in for yourself. You have to. I shared some ideas with you. You have to think for yourself and decide, is this applicable to me in my organization? You'll be foolish to adopt what other organizations have done without deciding how can I adopt that? How can I apply that in my organization? Now, this is something that we've still got a little bit of time in the recording, so I can record this. This is something I was been thinking about for a while, and I think it was late last week, I wrote this in an article on LinkedIn. I've made some slides to support the idea. It's about it's called New Works Resolutions. It's a bit like New Year's resolutions. It's about how difficult it is to change things at work. It's like a New Year's resolution. You say, I'm going to stop eating sugar, and you stop eating sugar for the first 2 days of January, and then you go back to your own habits. It's very difficult to break habits. And I'm just thinking about why is it so difficult? And these are my thoughts on that topic of changing things. If you first think about your environment. There's stuff in your environment that concerns you and stuff that doesn't concern you, and I call that noise. So we're not interested in that. Within the area that concerns you, there's stuff that you can influence and stuff that you can't influence. But the stuff that concerns you that you can't influence is still relevant, but you just got to work with it. That's a given. That's something you've got to work around. But you can influence some things. And within the circle of influence, there's a circle of control. Things that you can control directly and things that you can influence indirectly by collaborating, communicating with other people. You may recognize these as the Stephen Covey's circles. He made that popular 10, 20 years ago, probably something like that, probably about 10 years ago. But it goes back to the old Greeks about 2,500 years ago. Before that, Epictetus came up with the concept of not worrying about the things that you can't change. You know, that's unhealthy. So just realize what you can't change and what you can change. Okay, so let's have a look at what we can control ourselves. And it's about sensing, thinking, believing, and acting. It's sensing without judgment, just observing the facts in the environment that you can control, that you can influence and that you can't influence. So what's going on in the environment that's relevant for you? Fact finding. That's the first stage. How good are you at observing? And I mentioned that previous quote, Taiichi Ono, the Toyota guy. He's a legendary figure in the Toyota production system, which was the precursor to the lean movement. He would, when he had new managers in the factory, he'd take them down to the shop floor, to the factory floor. He'd draw a circle with white chalk on the ground, on the floor, and he'd say, stand there and observe what's happening. So then he'd go away, and he'd leave the aspiring manager to observe what's going on in the factory, and he'd come back after an hour or so, and he'd say, what did you see? And you tell him what you saw this happening and that happening. He'd say, look again. They'd go off for another hour. They'd come back, and it would really, this is a hard way of learning, but it's being forced into observing what is actually happening in my environment. Looking at it, so you could think about your ability. How well are you observing? How well are you sensing what's going on? That's the first thing that you might like to improve. The second thing is making a judgment, thinking about what you've observed. Is it good or bad? Does it have potential for improvement? So that's the more rational part of things. Then you're getting more into the emotional section of choosing. So, you've come up with an idea. Maybe if we improve this, then we'll get better results. Now, do you believe that? Are you committed to that? Are you prepared to accept the consequences if it doesn't work? So that's the belief part. That's the decision-making part. How good are you at assessing the risks? And that's very much about emotions. After the fact, you translate those emotions into rational decisions. So you can explain both to yourself and to your boss why you took the decision. But essentially, all decisions are emotional first, after which you rationalize them. And then you act on the decision. And you, with most things, you could, within your circle of control, you can make limited improvements, but usually in order to make significant improvements, you need to be able to influence people. So influence stands not only for the domain of stuff that you can influence, but also for the ability to influence. In acting, you influence people. So think about how well you interact with people. Do you socialize with them enough to build a relationship so you can rely on them to do stuff when you need to do it? And finally, You were waiting for that, weren't you? Finally, the amount of energy, and this is really, that's sort of going down to the deepest values. How strongly do you believe in things? How highly are you motivated? How much energy do you have to change things? Some people have an enormous amount of energy, and they can move mountains, and other people can't. That's fine, but you've got to be realistic about the amount of energy that you have. And also, and for people in managerial roles, I think it's important to create some headroom, sort of above your head, so you've got some room to maneuver. You're not planned for 100% utilization at work, so you've got absolutely no time to think about improvements. You need a bit of slack, a bit of headroom to think about improvements. So then people can use their energy, whatever energy they have. At least that's not limited because of the pressure of daily work. There's a guy called Mike Orzen, who you might know if you've looked at Lean IT. He wrote a book on that. Mike says improving your daily work is more important than your daily work, which is a pretty strong statement, but I think it's good. It's good to think about. So create some, if you're a manager, create some headroom. Of course, you've got to make money, but it's not only about today, it's about tomorrow as well. It's that balance, now and then. Right. So that was the session. I'll just run you through the reference slides so they're in the recording. Here you've got a couple of DevOps books. First, if you're going to choose two books, I'd say these two. If you're more interested in stories, choose the first. If you just want to choose one, if you're more interested in stories, choose the first one. If you like facts, choose the second one. And in fact, if you look at the DevOps handbook, if you Google free excerpt, you'll find the first 2 or 3 chapters, I think, from the book free of charge, which is good. My white paper, Business Value of DevOps, is free of charge at the DevOps. Oh, that should be DevOps Agile Skills Association. Sorry, DASA. You'll find that easily enough. You'll have to register, and I think they'll probably send you mails about stuff, but that's pretty innocent. You can always unsubscribe. So you could do that. I've summarized lots of testing resources. In particular, you see Katerina Clokey mentioned down there. But the two ladies, Lisa Crispin and Janet Gregory, seem to be pretty notable experts in the field. Agile testing more than DevOps, but I think the difference isn't that significant. And that sixth bullet there, the podcast, that was the podcast I listened to and made some notes on. Oh yeah, and here's some of the stuff that I noted from Lisa Crispin, and she's got some great stuff. One of the things that I got from her was be very conscious about how you're spending your time. You could spend lots of time in doing regression testing and stuff like that, whereas the time might be better spent talking to customers or users and discovering what's really important and working on that. So she's and you can see in that last bullet here, competencies are more important than roles. You see that shift from roles, people who do certain things, to making sure that those things are done. She's also got stuff on this is more important than that. It's a bit like the Agile Manifesto. The stuff on the left-hand side is more important than the stuff on the right-hand side, but the stuff on the right-hand side also has value. So that's stuff to think about. These were the notes that I made, somewhat cryptic So they might need some explanation, or you might want to listen to the podcast. If you think that there might be something behind one of these points that's relevant for you, listen to the podcast. I think they're more or less in chronological sequence. And that was it. So with that, I am going to stop the slideshow and have a final look at the chat. Oh, there we are. It was my pleasure. As I said at the start, it's always fun to engage with Victor and his crew, and it's nice to, it's the physical conferences. There's a great vibe. It's a nice atmosphere. So it's nice to imagine that I might have met you in person at one of these conferences, or that I possibly will do in the future. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, I will leave the session and wish you well. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.